This is important stuff
for you to know.
Welcome to the show. This is Tony.
And this is Javier.
This is the show where we talk about what we believe may be important stuff.
But in the end, it's for you to decide.
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, Javier. There's been a lot of talk recently in the news about the IRS. We've heard a lot about spending tax dollars, wasteful spending of governments. In this segment, I'd like to talk a little bit about taxes. Let me throw a question out to you here. Why do we even have to pay income taxes? Where did that come from? Who came up with this idea?
Well, that's a good one. Maybe we had to go back in time and see, even though we're not historians, but we can just analyze maybe with however tools we have, to look at history. But if we go back, the history of our civilization, of man, we have to go back to the caveman. And imagine the caveman living alone in a cave. He couldn't tax anybody because, there was no reason for him to tax anybody for anything. Okay, eventually he walked out of the cave and he found a woman and he formed a family. Once again, there was no reason for him to tax anybody. So
his needs were pretty simple,
right? So if you follow this analysis, and then the family, then he went out hunting, and she stayed with the children. And when he went into the prairie to hunt deer, he saw another person, another man, another caveman, and he realized that there was somebody else around beside his family. He went back and said, I just saw another guy, or maybe he signaled to them, to his wife, and what is this? What do we do now? He's hunting for the same thing that we're hunting for. So maybe they decided to communicate, and they decided to join forces, and they started a tribe. But even then, at the moment that they form a tribe, still there's no reason to tax anybody. Okay, now when does it start? I think, when does it make sense for somebody to tax another person, to levy a tax or some form of compensation for a service?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's the key, the service. It's for service. When there are services maybe outside of that tribe or community that they need. At that point, in the caveman days, they needed food, they needed shelter. Health was very simple. Really, life and death was very simple. They didn't live too long. So they needed something beyond. When it got to a point, they needed something beyond their community.
No, but I think even within the community, because we follow this path, once they formed the tribe, then decided probably that the men will go hunting, and the women and the children and the elder maybe stayed in their camp or whatever you call that, okay, in the village. So they went out hunting, right? Now, here's another scenario. Suddenly they find another tribe, another group of hunters who are going, and things get pretty tense because they're looking for the same prey.
They're fighting.
Okay,
I see it.
So they say, "Wow, they run back to the village and say, listen, there's another tribe hunting in our grounds, and things got pretty heated. We have to protect ourselves. We cannot leave the family alone. So we're going to have to divide. Some hunters are going to go hunting, but we had to keep some men, maybe the stronger men, in the village to protect the people. But those people are not going to be hunting. So how can they live if they're not going to share from the hunt? So that somebody has to give food to them for the service of protecting the women and children. So I think at that point, for me, the concept of taxation starts, because the hunters are going to have to contribute some of their hunt, some of their meat or whatever, to those who stay behind to protect the women and children. But then you have the artisans. Some of those guys who stayed behind decided to work on stones, and maybe make a hammerhead, or maybe make a knife, or an arrowhead. And so they said to the hunters, listen, you don't have to waste time when you come back to make an arrow or make a sword
Spear.
or a spear. I'll make it for you, and you pay me for that. The guy said, okay, that makes sense. So yeah, I'm going to pay you for that. But then maybe the chief in the village says, oh, wait a minute. So you're getting benefit for something that you do for them while you should be taking care of the women and children, protecting. But you're getting extra food because you're doing some work. You have to share with us then. So here,
it becomes a community sharing.
Yeah, right.
Each one has a service and provides
Exactly.
something for the benefit. Let's move ahead in history.
Well, you go back then. If you follow that, I mean, you go to the village, then cities, towns, communities get bigger. These cities, and then we get into the Middle Ages.
Let's go to that.
Why do people? If you remember the history and you look at the movies, you have the feudal lord living in the castle, and then you have the servants, the serfs or whatever, living outside. Why do they live outside the castle?
Well, outside the castle, probably because they had to tend farms, grow crops, agriculture.
Exactly.
What was the purpose of the walls of the castle?
Protection to the feudal lord, to the nobility.
How did the people growing the crops benefit in that community?
Because that feudal lord had an army who was fed by the work of the people who lived outside. Right? They contributed from the crop to the community, to the whole community, so the people could stay inside the walls, training, fighting and training and boxing and whatever, and getting fit and getting ready for war. And whenever danger approached, they would run into the walls and they would, sound the alarm, and the soldiers would come out, cavalrymen would come out to protect the people. So this is how they were serving the people who were contributing the crops to feed the people inside the castle. So that was a tax.
Okay.
Now, how was that tax? Who decided? And here's the big issue now, Tony. And who decided up to that time, especially in the Middle Ages, up to, we're talking about 17th century, late Middle Ages, when did, who set the taxes? Who decided how much was the tax? How much do the people, the farmers who lived outside had to contribute to the...
I would say probably the nobility, the landowner, the person in the position of authority set the tax, what was required of the other citizens. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, well, he said you have to pay so much, and if you don't pay, you leave. So they had to pay. Now, is that fair? Probably not. But we forget something, that eventually, the feudal lords had to report to a king. So there was like some sort of double taxation, because they would tax the farmers, the people in the field in front of their castles, but then the king would send his people to collect taxes from the feudal lords. So it became a chain, right? Now, up to that point, it was the king or the feudal lord who set the taxes. People had no voice on that. Now, that is the reason why we had the civil wars in England, the three civil wars starting in 1640, I believe, around the mid 17th century, is that, they had been in war for 30 years, a 30-year war in Europe, and, they had no money, the king had no money, he was broke, and he started asking. There was a sort of a parliament that was only called to meet by the king whenever he wanted them to do something on his behalf.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't called King Charles hadn't called a parliament for years, and they were becoming upset because he was spending all the money in wars, and there was rationing in every aspect. So they went into the war. They had 3 wars, and finally was Cromwell. The king, the king was was decapitated, and they had finally a parliament that was making the decision of how much to tax. There was representation because they represented the people. So that is the concept, is representation.
As a basis of the American Revolution, it was taxation without representation.
100 years later.
Let's fast forward to current times. What do we get for paying taxes? Somebody came up with the idea, and it evolved that you're going to be taxed based on how much you earn. That doesn't sound like a fair system. So if you are, if you participate, you engage yourself, you are self-disciplined, and you make some sacrifices, and you build, your tax contribution is much greater. That doesn't sound.
Well, that's a big issue in taxation these days. I mean, everybody's complaining about should it be progressive? Should you be taxed at higher brackets depending on how much you make money because you're making more than you need? I mean, this is the concept of how much money do you need. Now, who is to tell me how much do I need?
Exactly.
Do I tell them how much you need? No, I think it's something that it all depends on. It's subjective. It depends on the individual. And if I need more, okay, I have to work more, right? Not physically necessarily. I can work smarter. So for that, I have to go to school and get ready and work my tail off. Okay, so I get experience, and then I have the knowledge and the expertise to maybe make money in a quantity that satisfies me. So that means hard work. That means working hard. I mean, unless you win the lotto, okay, that's another story. So the issue is, should tax be progressive? But even if it's progressive, okay, the concept of you paying more because you're making more, so far it's okay. Okay, it's okay. I mean, people, there are basic needs that you have to satisfy. So the closer you are to those basic needs, the less taxes you should pay. The farther away you get from that, then you're getting into the superfluous spending and so on. And so maybe you should be paying some taxes. That's the income tax. Then somebody came up with the idea, well, why don't we tax the people not on what they make, but on how they spend it? So that's why you have the sales tax.
Can we, and the use tax, that would be more of a national
value added. You have value added tax. Okay.
Now, let's talk about that. Can we abolish income tax and go to a value-added tax system and support those community services that we talked about way back in the caveman days? You need things outside of your community. We can't build roads as an individual. We can't fund an army. We can't build schools. It takes community, states, and a national system to build it. Can we abolish that income tax program and on value added fund those services?
Yeah, but again, I mean, you responded yourself. I mean, with value added, you cannot build a road. You cannot build a tunnel. You cannot, unless companies do that for profit. In some countries, private companies build airports, and they get the revenue that is generated by the airport services. Roads, tolls go into private companies. Mexico has been very famous for that. Okay, and they have been doing that in some other places in Latin America, I believe. Okay, that concept. But you have to pay for something. I mean, if you're a citizen of a country, if you're a citizen or a resident, or you live in the U.S., somehow you're benefiting from a lot of services that are given to you that should not be free. Number one, security, protection. Right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, infrastructures. The firemen, the police,
building of schools,
health, and so on. So there are many things that are provided by the government, and the government does not produce money. In the U.S., in other countries they do.
Yes.
You have
oil reserves and precious metals.
You have the corporate state,
such.
Okay, but not in the U.S. So the U.S. is not a money-making machine; it's a money-spending machine.
Yes.
And the money that the government needs has to come from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Since we are not invaders, we don't go to war, and we don't invade other countries and we loot them for money. The money has to come from us,
Citizens
from the
within, from the
citizens.
whole
So that makes
population. Yeah.
sense. The issue is, and here I think here's the issue, is that what is rational, what is logical, okay, to tax from people? Is it logical or rational or acceptable to tax somebody who has worked all his life and has accumulated an X amount of money and wealth and position, to force him to pay taxes to give it to somebody else who hasn't tried, hasn't worked as hard, and hasn't made the sacrifices that you made or somebody made to be able to accumulate more money? This is where the big dispute arises. I mean, when does it make sense to take money from you to give it to somebody else? What is the reasoning? What is the logic? Is it moral? Is it ethical?
I think there is a compassionate side to it.
No, but yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's altruism.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's voluntary. Okay,
Yes.
and the U.S. has been, I mean, we know that has been known. People here believe in charities a lot, and you go to the churches of any denomination. Okay, and people do provide schools, food, health services on an altruistic manner. Okay,
Right.
they worry about the other people.
Mm-hmm.
But when they tell you that I'm going to take your money to give it to somebody else, and they're putting their hands in your pockets. Okay, and that's why sometimes people get kind of itchy. They get very upset, and this disputes that eventually.
And we're seeing that all over the news now. Okay, let's try to wrap this up and summarize here. Okay, is it fair then to summarize? We both agree there has to be, for the perpetuation of community,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be some measure of a tax contribution by most of all people, and there's a compassionate or altruistic side, as you said, that some of that has to go for those that may be less fortunate for whatever the reasons are. But back to the caveman days. You can't participate at the table if you don't participate in the services or the hunt or the community. Is this a fair summary, would you say, to wrap up here?
No, definitely, yes. I mean, it's obvious. You just said it, and we talked about it before, is that the services that you're taking benefit of, that you should pay for that. Okay? It makes sense that I pay for something that I'm using or that is benefiting me and my family. That's okay. Now, when the tax, and let me use this word, maybe it's too harsh, but that's reality. When the tax is punitive, when you are punishing me because I'm successful, to take my money, to give it to somebody else, I don't want to say less fortunate, because this is, in many times, it's not a matter of luck.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter, and that's what, when they say, no, the less fortunate, it's not the less fortunate. For some reason, they didn't try, or things didn't go their way. Most of the time, there's no luck involved. Okay, so I have to find another word that is not the less fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but they take money from some people to give it to other people, and they justify that because of social conscience, maybe. I don't know what the exact. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense.
The problem is that, and is that when you do that transfer of wealth, when you do the redistribution of wealth, it becomes a great political tool. Because when you take money from the rich and you give it to the poor, the poor are going to be very happy. And guess who they will vote for in the next election?
Absolutely.
So that becomes a tool of political perpetuation for you to remain in power for a long time. Just taxing the rich to give it to the poor. And that's where the whole concept of taxation becomes a turbulent matter.
We agree we need the tax. It's a matter, we can go on for hours on this, but it's a matter of selecting the right method to get to services for all the people. We better wrap this up here. We're going to pause here for a commercial break, and we'll be right back with you after a 30-second commercial.
We'll be back.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. While we were off air, Javier and I were talking. This topic on taxes is important and can go on for quite a while. But Javier, you made a good point while we were off air. But continue that point that you were talking about progressive tax rates or situations on how much and.
What would you think if you have a company and you're a successful businessman and you're making, let's say, an X amount of money? Let's put a number. Let's say $1 million. You're very successful and you're making $1 million a year, and because of this progressive taxation, your marginal rate would be 100%, or let's say not 100, let's say it's 90% of every $10 that you make, 9 go to the government. How would you feel?
Well, that's bizarre. Javier, that's bizarre. Who would ever start a company and set the revenue? That doesn't even make sense. Nobody would even have any interest in participating in that. You're better off just working a small little job in a convenience store down the street.
So you're telling me it's not reasonable, right?
Well, obviously it's not reasonable.
Okay.
It would kill
what
small
if I
businesses.
told you? What if I told you that in the last, let's say, close to 100 years, you had marginal tax rates hovering around the 90%?
You mean income tax rates, where the federal government actually required?
They were taxing people marginally, okay, or 90% in the 20s, in the 1920s for almost a decade, 8 years, and then in the 40s up to, I think, the late 50s. So you're talking about maybe 15, 18 years again. Okay, that people were being taxed. Some people were being taxed at marginally at around 90%.
This wasn't all income. This was this progressive? It was.
Yeah, well, it's in tranches, you know. That's so they were, you know, the last tranche of income that they would receive was taxed at, let's say, 90%. You know, the first tranche maybe was 40, 30, 40, 50. I don't recall. But to me, I was always wondering, you know, if there were any time in the history of the U.S. where people were being marginally taxed at 100%. And there were quite a few years, probably, I mean, 18 plus 8, you're talking about 25 years. I mean, one quarter of the century, 25 years during the century.
Where it was actually 90%.
Close to 90%. Uh-huh.
That is bizarre. I was right. Uh-huh. That is bizarre.
And that's important stuff to know.
That is important stuff out of our history, and I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Well, let me, staying on the taxes, let me throw this out to you. When do you know that you're taxed too much? Obviously, 90% is insane. Mm-hmm. That's too much. But when do you know when you tax too much?
When do you know that you pay too much for something? If you buy something, when do you feel that you pay too much?
When, in my mind, let's say a sandwich in a delicatessen. If they keep pushing the price up higher because it's popular, then the value that you receive for that same sandwich is not equal to what you have to put out for the.
That's a good explanation. Now, in the case of taxes, you know, when when do you think you're being taxed too much? Well, the only way for you to compare, to relate to something, is to the other side. Okay, your taxes, it's a source of income to the government. So you want to look at the other side. It's how that money is being spent. If you see that the spending by the federal government is wasteful, I mean, then you say, why do I have to pay taxes for that? I'm willing to pay taxes because I live here for a lot of the services, and like I said before, that are bringing me benefit. Okay, for that I'm willing to pay. Why should I be taxed? Why should my family have to pay for spending that is not necessary? In other words, that is wasteful. That is when you think that you're paying more than you should. Okay, because the people to whom you entrusted the management of your money, of the money of the whole community, the nation, are not managing the money in the way that they should.
So people, and I think all would agree, people don't mind paying tax to the community. But when, what you're saying, when the spending goes out of balance or becomes a little bizarre, then you know you're paying too much. That's when the pressure is added. Here's a concept that I want to throw out. You have many, many years of business experience in the corporate world. You have a lot of experience interacting with governments and organizations that interact with governments. Governments don't produce anything. Governments are formed to serve the people. Has that concept been forgotten?
I would say yes, not totally. Okay, because there are sometimes you see manifestations where the government does pay tribute to the constituents. Okay, to the people they theoretically represent.
They pay tribute.
I mean, tribute, they honor, they respect, they are responsible to. For example, once a year, the President of the United States presents the State of the Union.
Okay,
so
now
he goes.
I follow.
All right, so I mean, and it's to Congress, but Congress the Congress people are the representatives of the people.
Yes, that's
okay,
right.
So in a way, symbolically, the president it's paying tribute. Okay, he's responding. He's showing his responsibility towards the people that elected him. Okay, so yes. Now, the issue is that it's accountability when the government is acting in a way that is beyond the mandate that they have received. Okay, when they may not be serving the interests of the people. Now the issue is the government a money-making machine? Because if the government by itself was generating income, okay, then maybe there could be some justification that part of the spending that the government is making, they're entitled to do it because they generated that income through production or whatever, right? And this is the difference between companies and governments. And I'm not talking only about the U.S. government. In other countries, it may be different, where you have corporate states, where the state, for example, is the owner of the resources, and they produce, and they are the ones who generate most of the revenue, most of the reserves. Okay, so they think that they can spend it as they wish, and they forget that they are also accountable to the people.
I think you've hit on a big point. Accountability.
Yes.
This is where it is. And you had a practical example. I've heard you talk about this before. You've attended many conferences. You've spoken at many conferences for private corporations have invited you, or you've been involved with private corporations. What's the comparison? Should governments do the same thing, emulate private corporations? Because, again, have they forgotten? I see too many signs where they may.
Well, I mean, number one, the cost benefit. Each one has a different pattern of cost benefit. Okay, companies follow one cost benefit. I would say analysis on what they do. The government has a different one. Okay, the companies are accountable to their shareholders. In principle, actually, they should be accountable to the customers.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes you hear our clients' interests come first. I wish that was true, but they always say, we have to respond to the shareholders. Governments, in the case of governments, it's different because governments, they are accountable to the people who elected them, not to a particular group of people. So they have a major accountability. They have to respond. So it is very difficult to make a comparison between the two because they have to operate differently. However, there are things that private companies do that should be seen as an example by the federal government. Okay, some of the things they do, the training, maybe some form of compensation,
strict budgeting,
benefits,
strict budgeting,
budgeting, and strategic planning, not just reacting when something happens, but they have to be proactive, which normally it's not very often. So I agree that the governments, even state governments and local governments, should learn from corporations. In spite of that, many people criticize the private sector. Okay, and as you know, there have been some abuses. Okay, yes. Now I think it has to be proportionate. Okay, and somebody has to overlook how that spending is being made, because in the case of corporations, they had to go to the shareholders meeting and the budget committee, and people will see, and then the accountants who do the auditing, they will report if they see something that is out of line.
But they are producing their revenue. They're generating
exactly,
their revenue.
But the management is accountable to the shareholders.
Yes.
And the board of directors to the shareholders. So they have an accountability instance, okay, to whom they have to report. Now, the federal government, in theory, has to report to the people. Correct?
Correct. They don't generate the revenue. We entrust them with the revenue.
So they're entrusted to managing, and therefore they should spend that money in a way that benefits everybody, not just a group of people, who maybe benefit excessively from the allowances that they're getting from the government. So this is a very touchy issue of yes, they can learn from the private sector, but then they have to behave differently because they have, number one, they have not generated that income. Okay, so they have more accountability to the people who gave them the money to spend it. And one thing that is critical, and I forgot to mention that now that I'm talking about this, is transformation. Because the money that a shareholder gives to the manager of the company is transformed into revenue, into something that it's valued, which value is higher. So there is a value added from every money that they get from the shareholders and from the creditors. Okay, in the case of the government, no. I mean, I give them $1 of taxes, and they spend the $1 in something. So so there is no wealth created.
Yes.
In theory, okay. Maybe there will be instances where you can say yes, they created wealth. Well, because they helped build the roads that the companies didn't have to build, and so on. I mean, this could be we could be talking for days.
For days. This was an important, but I think it was important that we came back to this because this was a continuation of our first segment, and I think the most important thing that we can come away with here from our discussion, a point you made earlier, that when we were talking about people don't mind paying taxes, everyone contributes. When the spending becomes out of control, people begin to believe they're paying too much tax. Mm-hmm. When taxes become punitive, people begin to feel they're paying too much tax. So, on that note, great conversation. We'll get back to this again.
That was a good one today.
Yes.
A good topic.
Very good. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back, everybody. Javier, this is a segment that we get a lot of feedback on or suggestions. This is important stuff.
Or is it?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to let you decide. Around the world, around the country, we have a lot of warning labels. We have a lot of signs. Let me throw a few out. Okay. Saw this on a disclaimer on the package of Trojan condoms.
Ooh.
The disclaimer said, use for sex only, not to be eaten. Wow. That sounds like important stuff.
Oh yeah, but probably written by a lawyer. Maybe the Trojan company got sued at one point in time because maybe during the mating somebody ate one and asphyxiated. So yeah, I mean maybe for a beginner, for adolescents, you know.
I think for a beginner they should be making different choices. So maybe it is important stuff, but that's a pretty select audience.
Yeah, yeah, but I think yeah, because some of them are flavored, so and they have some of them have colors, you know that. So yeah, I think it is.
That's important stuff.
I'll give okay to that one.
Well, Javier, we've come to the end of the show.
We certainly had a good time, and we hope our listeners did too.
Maybe along the way, someone even learned something.
And remember, if you think something is
important stuff,
let us know, and we will talk about it.
So, until next time, hasta la vista.